Hey guys, tonight we're going to peel back the layers of history to reveal a truth so unsettling. It's been buried for centuries, literally. Imagine standing in the hushed, echoing silence of Westminster Abbey, not to admire the grandeur, but to witness something no one was ever meant to see. We're talking about what really lies inside the tomb of England's most celebrated monarch, Queen Elizabeth I. Forget the portraits of the powerful Virgin Queen. The reality is far more gruesome. A lead coffin, an overpowering stench of decay, and a macabre sight that could change everything you thought you knew about how the living treat the dead. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love that we can explore these historical stories together from all corners of the globe, united by our shared curiosity about the past. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. On a frosty February morning in 1869, Westminster Abbey stood silent beneath a shifting veil of mist, as if reluctant to betray the dark work unfolding within. A single torch flickered against the ancient stones, its wavering light casting long, quivering shadows across the Gothic arches. Every few heartbeats, the steady ring of pickaxes striking stone echoed through the vaulted chamber, a dull percussion that seemed to mark time itself slowing to a crawl. Dean Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, clutching architectural sketches in one hand and burial records in the other, leaned over a narrow fissure in the marble floor. Beneath that slender crack lay centuries of dust, and with it, the faint but unmistakable perfume of decay, an odour so subtly pungent it stirred his every nerve with uneasy anticipation. Stanley's eyes traced the mismatched lines on his parchment. The maps showed King James I interred in a separate vault, yet not a single entry in the official registers offered any confirmation of his resting place. How odd, he thought, that a monarch so prominent could vanish from the records as though swallowed by the earth itself. His breath puffed out in little clouds, each exhale mingling with the ancient chill. Beyond the narrow hole, men crouched with lanterns and trowels, pale faces etched with equal parts dread and fascination. They worked with hushed care, chipping away at stone that had not been touched for generations. At length, a soft crash resounded as a fragment of rock fell inward, revealing a cramped chamber just beyond. Stanley's heart fluttered in his chest as the torchlight revealed two leaden coffins, stacked one atop the other like a grim set of bunk beds. The upper casket was larger, its once gleaming surface now mottled with a greenish patina. Carved across its length was the rose emblem of the Tudors, and in graceful Latin script, the name Elizabeth I. The sudden realization struck him like a pale sunrise through a storm cloud. Here lay the Virgin Queen herself, pressed unceremoniously upon the body of her half-sister, Mary Tudor. The cruel symbolism was not lost on Stanley James. The first had, it seemed, arranged even the dead to reflect his own sovereignty, allowing Elizabeth to loom above Mary in life and enforcing the same hierarchy in death. A thick wave of rancid air billowed upward, carrying the scent of sulphurous gas and decaying flesh. It was as though the royal betrayal had been distilled into a single breath, declaring to all who dared intrude that power extends beyond life, demanding its right even from the grave. The workmen recoiled, shielding their noses and coughing in the dim light. Stanley himself felt the urge to retreat, yet the scholar in him compelled closer scrutiny. He noted the elegance of the carving, the precision of the Latin letters, and the way the lead had conformed to every contour of the body beneath an unintentional memorial to the human form slowly yielding to time. In that moment, the vast hush of the abbey seemed to swell, as if the very stones were straining to bear witness. The torchlight danced upon the water-green patina, revealing streaks where the coffin's metal had corroded, as though tears had streamed down its sides. The scene might have been plucked from a Gothic novel, a noble queen laid to rest in lead, her body stacked above another in a silent testament to political intrigue. Yet it was no fiction. Stanley, with the temperament of an archaeologist and the meticulous eye of a historian, understood that this discovery would upend everything scholars thought they knew about Tudor funerary practices. More than unearthing bones, he was unraveling an unspoken saga of rivalry, devotion, and the unquenchable thirst for supremacy that even death could not quell. As he studied the coffins, Stanley reflected on the life Elizabeth had led, the brilliant monarch who had thwarted the Spanish Armada, who had held court with a wit as sharp as any blade, and who had governed England with a blend of intelligence and resolve unmatched in her age. Here she was now, silent and still, her memory preserved in metal but her flesh long since returned to dust. The coffin above, burdened by lead and legend, bore witness to her final humiliation. Elevated in status in death only by resting atop her own flesh, just as she had once been elevated above all earthly rivals. With a gentle motion, Stanley signalled the lantern-bearer to hold back the shadows, allowing him to record every detail. He sketched the rose emblem and copied the Latin inscription, his handwriting deliberate despite the numbness creeping through his fingers. Each stroke anchored the moment in posterity, ensuring that future generations would know of this macabre tableau. And yet, even as he chronicled the grandeur and the gore, his voice whispered in his mind, "What other secrets lie buried beneath these stones?" In that sombre stillness, the story of Elizabeth I, youthful, brilliant and sorrowfully mortal, began anew, not in the regal halls of Greenwich or the bustling streets of London, but here, in the subterranean gloom where history's darkest truths waited patiently to be told. On a chilly morning of March 24th in 1603, Richmond Palace lay cloaked in an almost reverent hush, as though the very stones held their breath. A pale dawn light filtered through stained glass windows, casting muted patterns of crimson and gold across the tiled floor. Queen Elizabeth I stood alone in her private chamber, propped upright on layers of opulent cushions and bolsters. For more than 15 hours, she had refused to lie down, her slender frame trembling as it leaned against pillows swathed in velvet and silk. The plush supports once symbols of luxury and royal comfort had become, in these final, fragile hours, the only barrier between her and the void she feared lay within horizontal rest. Her ladies-in-waiting hovered at discreet distances, their embroidered skirts whispering against the floor as they shifted uneasily. They murmured prayers beneath their breath, voices hushed, yet thick with dread. Each time a door creaked open, Elizabeth's head would twitch, her wide eyes scanning the flickering candlelight for threats real or imagined. The Queen's hair, once the vibrant copper glory of youth, now lay thin and dull, strands clinging to her temples in scattered tufts. Her porcelain skin had drawn taut over high cheekbones, revealing a network of blue veins that mapped her frailty. Where her brilliant smile had once charmed courtiers and diplomats alike, her lips now pressed into a pale line, and the gums behind her remaining teeth were darkened by illness and neglect. In the circle of flickering torchlight, Elizabeth Southwell, one of the Queen's most loyal attendants, later recounted the grim tableau. She described a single playing card, its surface yellowed with age, pierced through the centre by a rusted nail. The card depicted a skeletal figure draped in a tattered courtier's garb, its empty eyes fixed in eternal accusation. Elizabeth had found it pinned to the back of her throne as if placed by unseen hands, an omen that preyed upon her mind. Night after night, she dreamt of her flesh rotting away, of bones crumbling like ash beneath her touch. In her final days, the spectre of decay stalked her thoughts more relentlessly than any earthly enemy. Despite the chamber's sumptuous decor, velvet tapestries embroidered with Tudor roses, gilded cornices carved with angelic faces, an aura of desolation pervaded the space. No trumpets heralded her approach. No strains of an organ's lament accompanied her breaths. Instead, the palace corridor beyond her door stood empty, save for the occasional solemn tread of a guard or the soft rustle of book pages turned by a court scholar. Even the air seemed to hang heavier, as if gravity itself pressed down upon the Queen's fragile frame. As the morning wore on, the cushions began to shift beneath her weight, their goose-down filling compressed into lumpy oblongs. Attendants rearranged them gingerly, smoothing out creases and fluffing the edges, though each adjustment seemed to send a fresh ripple of fear through Elizabeth's digits. She clutched the silk draperies at her sides, knuckles white against the rich fabric, as if those folds might somehow tether her to the realm of the living. The sight of her anxious grip, so at odds with her usual regal composure, rendered even the most hardened courtiers speechless. By midday, a cadre of physicians arrived in powdered wigs and black robes, their faces lined with concern. They bent over her shoulders, their stethoscopes pressing coolly against layers of brocade and linen. They murmured to one another in Latin, quoting obscure remedies and formulations meant to bolster her failing strength. Yet their practiced hands, once so steady in the drawing rooms of state, shook imperceptibly as they recorded her pulse. Elizabeth's breath had grown shallow, each exhale a frail whisper that fluttered through the chamber like a startled bird's final flutter. The Queen's eyes, once bright with wit and determination, now shimmered with a distant, haunting light. She seemed half present, half adrift, as though suspended between memory and oblivion. At one point, she raised a trembling hand and traced an invisible pattern upon the armrest of her seat, her fingers lingering on carved roses that glinted faintly in the candle glow. The gesture spoke of a mind clinging desperately to remnants of control, to the rituals that had defined her reign. As the shadows lengthened and the sky outside shifted from pale gold to dusky rose, the hush in the chamber deepened. Elizabeth's attendants lit additional candles, their flames sputtering in the gentle draught that circled the room. The walls, lined with portraits of her ancestors, kings and queens, who had once wielded absolute power, seemed to close in around her. Yet none of that ancestral might could rescue her now. The crown upon her head, which in life she had borne with poise and authority, lay untouched upon a nearby velvet cushion, as if awaiting her final repose. Then, as twilight settled into the corners of the chamber, Elizabeth's knees buckled with a soft, childlike sigh. The cushions, which had borne her fear so faithfully, yielded at last, and her body crumpled into their embrace with a gentle inevitability. There was no dramatic final utterance, no flourish of fanfare, only the profound silence that followed when a life slips away. In that stillness, the weight of her passing pressed down upon all present. Courtiers stifled sobs, physicians lowered their heads, and her ladies-in-waiting reached out as though to catch a ghost. Outside the chamber, the palace seemed to exhale in collective sorrow. The corridors, once filled with the bustle of state, fell quiet. The guards, standing sentinel at the door, bowed their heads in respect rather than prison-like vigilance. A single bird in the courtyard sang out its evening song, a stark reminder that life, in some form, endures even when the greatest of monarchs fades. Her final moments left an indelible mark upon the annals of history. The Virgin Queen, who had commanded fleets and courtiers, wielded words as deftly as any sword, and embodied the spirit of an age, now lay motionless among her cushions. Her solitary vigil upon plush bolsters became legend, a testament to the fragility of power and the inevitability of mortality. In life, she had defied the Pope, vanquished the Armada, and ruled with a blend of resolve and intelligence unmatched in her era. In death, she faced the same fate as every mortal, the gentle, unyielding embrace of the final sleep. And so, as Elizabeth I surrendered her breath to the unfolding dusk, she imparted a lesson more enduring than any royal decree, that no crown, no scepter, no fleet of warships can bar the gates of eternity. The plush cushions that had borne her terror became silent witnesses to her last stand. The chamber's grandeur, with its gilded cornices and polished floors, faded into memory. What remained was the quiet truth that even the greatest of sovereigns must one day lay down their head upon a pillow, and there, in that delicate moment between wakefulness and sleep, yield to the hush of mortality. After Queen Elizabeth I passed away on March 24th in 1603, her state funeral was held with solemn grandeur on April 28th of the same year. Dawn broke over London as the funeral cortege assembled, a silent river of black velvet and polished wood flowing through the heart of the city. The coffin, a stately chest of fine oak, painted a deep, regal purple, lay draped in sumptuous velvet embroidered with gold thread. Atop this bier stood a life-sized effigy of the late Queen, carved from wood and painted with such meticulous care that one might swear she might stir her painted lips at any moment. The effigy clasped a gilded scepter in its right hand, and bore a crown of tempered gold upon its head. Every fold of the sculpted gown was rendered with exacting precision, each wrinkle on the sculpted wrist a testament to her dignity. As the procession wound its way through the ancient streets, tens of thousands of onlookers pressed shoulder to shoulder along both sides of the road. Their faces were pale, lit by the soft, grey light of an overcast spring morning. Mothers held children aloft on tired shoulders so that they might glimpse the magnificent yet mournful sight. Elderly townsfolk, leaning on canes, watched through tear-blurred eyes as the cortege passed, their memories rekindled by the sight of their sovereign's final journey. The clip-clop of the horses' hooves on the cobblestones fell into a steady rhythm, a percussion that matched the slow, measured pace of the hearse. The horses, each draped in black velvet, moved with solemn grace, their heads bowed as though in homage. The carriage windows were framed with ebony shutters, and the wheels, polished to a jet-black sheen, turned without a whisper. Yet from within the carriage came a faint rustle, as if the ghost of her courtly presence fluttered once more against the confines of the hearse. Rain threatened, but only a handful of droplets fell, hissing quietly on the velvet coverings. Behind the hearse followed a line of noblemen and ambassadors, their cloaks heavy with the damp air. They wore mourning bands of deepest sable at their sleeves, and their swords, normally symbols of honor and power, hung unused at their sides. Each man walked with head bowed, fingers brushing the hilts of their blades in veiled tribute. The ambassadors of foreign courts, some Spanish, some French, some from as far afield as the Low Countries, strode in stiff silence, their ornate uniforms absorbing the muted colours of the city in grief. As the procession turned onto Cheapside, the roar of the crowd stilled to a collective gasp. The bells of St. Paul's Cathedral tolled in slow, sonorous peals, each chime a reminder of the Queen's longevity and the finality of her reign. Thousands crossed themselves at once, lips moving in silent prayer. A hush descended so complete that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. At Ludgate Hill, the carriage paused briefly so that the Dean of Westminster might recite passages from the Book of Common Prayer. His voice, gentle and measured, drifted over the silent throng. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life. Tears glistened on the faces of women in black veils, and even the most hardened merchants paused in their daily rounds to bow their heads. Remarkably, no post-mortem examination had been permitted. The body remained untouched by surgeons' hands, preserved within the ornate coffin and effigy that concealed any sign of decay. The court's insistence on forbidding any dissection was widely whispered to be a political maneuver, ensuring that no scandal of illness or corruption could tarnish the enduring legend of the Virgin Queen. It was said that her physique might have revealed truths the crown wished to hide, perhaps evidence of disease, perhaps the ravages of age that would diminish her crafted image of eternal strength. Thus, the lead coffin remained sealed, its surface gleaming under the overhangs of the hearse like a dark promise, unchanged by the passage of time. Yet the coffin's lead lining became a topic of hushed conversation throughout the palace and beyond. Servants who laboured in the catacombs below Westminster spoke of a foul stench when the vault was first opened, an odour so rank that it clawed at the throat and lingered in the mind long after the fresh air had chased it away. Sailors from the nearby docks, called upon to haul the heavy coffin at the funeral's conclusion, recoiled at the memory of that sulphurous breath. Even the most decorous noblewomen whispered behind veils about the irony that a monarch so resplendent in life could not escape the natural process of decay. The sumptuous purple drapes, the gilded effigy, and the velvet pall, all these were but fragile veils to conceal what nature demanded: the breaking down of flesh, the release of gases, the inevitable return to dust. As the cortege approached Westminster Abbey, the sun broke through a parting sluice of clouds, illuminating the carved facade with a heavenly glow. The crowd, once the silent witness to this mournful spectacle, stirred at the sight. Some crossed themselves again, others stood in stunned reverence. The choir, gathered within the abbey's vast nave, launched into a plainchant of Requiem aeternam dona ius, Domine, their voices rising in gentle waves that filled the sacred air. The echo of their song chased away the last shadows, even as the coffin trundled past the great bronze doors. Inside the abbey, beneath the soaring arches and between rows of kneeling mourners, the coffin was carried with solemn ceremony to the vault of Henry VIII, where Elizabeth's grandfather lay entombed. As the heavy lid was lifted, candles flickered over the polished edge of the purple pall. The carved wooden effigy, flawless in its eternal repose, was removed first and placed on a bier to rest beside the altar. Then the coffin itself, sealed and unexamined, was lowered gently into the earth, the faint scrape of lead against stone echoing like a final heartbeat. A final prayer was spoken by Dean Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, his voice soft yet unwavering. May her soul, through God's infinite mercy, rest in peace and rise in glory. A solitary tear glinted on his cheek before he knelt, his posture a blend of devotion and sorrow. The abbey doors closed behind him with a sonorous thud that resonated through the nave and beyond, sealing Elizabeth I's earthly chapter. As the mourners dispersed into the grey London afternoon, the empty streets seemed to breathe with a new solemnity. The black velvet drums and banners, once carried aloft, were furled and stored away. The bells fell silent, leaving only the whisper of the wind through the tracery of stone. The citizens, lingering in small clusters, shared one last hushed thought, that death, though often adorned in the richest silks and crowned with the loftiest honours, remains the one truth that no velvet cloak nor gilded mask can defy. And so, London returned to its daily rhythms, forever marked by the memory of that procession, an exquisite display of splendour and sorrow, a final tribute to a queen who, in death as in life, held the hearts of her people captive until the very end. 3 years after Queen Elizabeth I was laid to rest on a crisp spring morning of 1603, her successor, King James I, quietly set in motion plans to relocate her mortal remains. In the dim light of Henry VII's chapel, tradesmen and artisans moved with hushed precision, their tools, chisels, hammers, and mallets tapping softly against stone and wood as they prepared a new resting place. Among them were Master Maximilian Colt, the sculptor entrusted with crafting the white marble monument, and Master Jean Dretz, the painter charged with illuminating its carved inscriptions. Only these craftsmen and a handful of trusted workmen knew the full extent of the operation, for the rest of the court was kept deliberately in the dark. The chapel, which had sheltered the bones of monarchs for nearly a century, took on an air of whispered anticipation. The walls, draped in drab tapestries that depicted scenes from the Wars of the Roses, seemed to lean inward, as though eavesdropping on the clandestine affair. Under the vault's lofty arches, Colt's apprentices measured and marked the marble blocks by candlelight, their chalk lines delicate against the stone's pale surface. Nearby, Dretz mixed pigments in earthenware bowls, preparing the subtle hues that would contrast with the marble's pristine whiteness. At dawn on a misty morning in 1606, the workmen gathered their lanterns and began the solemn procession underground. A small band of labourers carried the lead-lined coffins of both Elizabeth and Mary Tudor through the chapel's crypt, their footsteps echoing like heartbeat pulses in the still air. Elizabeth's coffin, polished and unblemished, led the way. Its lead skin reflected the lantern glow in soft glimmers, and the name Elizabeth I remained stamped in elegant Latin script along its edge. Behind it, Mary's coffin followed a simpler vessel, its lead tarnished by years buried beneath the earth, its surface pitted and dull. When the two coffins were positioned side by side in the new vault, those present observed a carefully orchestrated hierarchy. Elizabeth's bier was set upon a low dais of hewn stone, elevated by a handful of sandstone blocks. Mary's lay directly beneath, nestled into a carved recess in the floor. The arrangement was unmistakable. The Virgin Queen, triumphant in life and legend, would rest above her half-sister, who had reigned only briefly and whose legacy was fraught with religious controversy. Their bones, once so fiercely divided by politics and faith, now lay in silent adjacency. Above the coffins, Master Colt's monument took shape. He carved a sculpted effigy of Elizabeth enrobed in flowing robes, the folds of her gown captured with such finesse that they appeared to billow even in the cold, still marble. Her crown sat perfectly atop her head, and her sceptre rested in her right hand. The effigy's gaze was calm and resolute, as though she surveyed the crypt with the same regal poise she had once upheld on the throne. At each corner of the plinth, Colt placed 4 lions, symbols of strength and courage, each gold-plated to catch the feeble light of recessed torches. On the monument's front, Dretz painted an inscription in raised letters, gilding only Elizabeth's name and her years of reign. Elizabeth I, sovereign of England, Ireland and France, protector of the realm and defender of the faith, Anno Domini 1590-73 to 1603. Below that, in a more modest script, the inscription alluded to Mary Tudor only obliquely, referring to her as Mary Tudor, once Queen of this isle. No further detail tempered the statement. It was diplomatic on the surface, but pointedly revealed the true intent. Elizabeth's glory would eclipse Mary's even in death. Yet beneath the monument's ornate veneer lay a darker reality. The vault was narrow, scarcely more spacious than a storage closet. Elizabeth's lead coffin, weighing several hundred pounds, bore down relentlessly on Mary's frame below. Over the course of 2 centuries, the press of metal and marble had forced Mary's remains into a grotesque compression. Testimonies from later vault openings spoke of decayed matter seeping from between coffin seams, the lead having acted as a pressure chamber for the gases of decomposition. Bits of dark fluid, the byproduct of the body's dissolution, pooled around Mary's coffin, painting the stone floor in macabre stains. This double-decker tomb, as some later chroniclers called it, stood as a chilling testament to the ruthless game of royal politics. It was a spectacle of power that transcended life itself, where even death became a field upon which dynastic ambitions played out. To James I, this reburial was more than an act of filial devotion. It was a physical manifestation of his authority over the Tudor legacy. By arranging the sisters in this stark hierarchy, he proclaimed to Europe that his mother's Protestant line triumphed over her Catholic sibling, that the Church of England would endure, and that the myth of the Virgin Queen would remain inviolate. In the decades that followed, pilgrims descended into the crypt to pay homage, some leaving coins and prayers at the foot of the marble monument. Few spoke openly of the vault's grim conditions. The orchestrated pageantry above ground solemn chants, flickering candles, the ethereal glow of stained glass served to obscure the vault's true purpose. Church officials and royal courtiers maintained a discreet silence about the unpleasant aspects of the tomb, preferring instead to present a narrative of sacred remembrance and continuity. Yet the truth persisted among the faithful, that royal remains, far from resting in peace, were manipulated as stones in a dynastic chess game. The cold, unyielding marble and lead belied the humanity that had once animated those two royal sisters, and beneath the polished surface lay a raw testament to the lengths power would go to preserve its image. Here, in the shadowed depths of Henry VII's chapel, the politics of life and death intertwined, leaving a legacy that whispered of betrayal, devotion, and the inexorable force of ambition. Through it all, the whispers continued. How long could such artifice endure? How long would the vault remain sealed before curious minds demanded answers? And when that day came, what revelations would lie alongside the marble lions and gilded lettering? For now, though, the crypt remained undisturbed, its grim order reflecting the unspoken truth, that in the world of kings and queens, even the grave is but another battlefield. On a chill February morning in 1869, Westminster Abbey found itself at the centre of an unexpected crisis. The vault of Henry VII, once tended with solemn care, had fallen into neglect, its records a tangle of errors and omissions. Tombs thought to lie in one place were discovered elsewhere on parchment maps that could not agree. King James I's burial, too, had slipped from the official rolls, leaving only whispered rumours and contradictory notes in the Abbey's musty archives. Queen Victoria, ever mindful of her realm's storied past, granted Dean Arthur Penrhyn Stanley permission to launch a full investigation of the Abbey's underground crypts. Thus, on the 11th of February, 1869, exactly 366 years after the death of Elizabeth of York Stanley, and his small cadre of workmen set out to pierce the layers of time and mortar that had concealed the royal dead. At first light, a team of stonemasons and gravediggers assembled before a sealed door of pale stone. Stanley, clad in his scholarly robes, watched as the masons chipped away at the thick mortar, each tap echoing faintly under the vault's solemn arches. As the final barrier was breached, a panel swung open with a reluctant groan, revealing a narrow passage steeped in shadows. Torches were lit, their golden flames dancing upon walls layered with centuries of dust. The corridor beyond twisted and turned like a labyrinth, its low ceiling forcing careful steps. Every surface, a wall, a block, a carved niche, was encrusted with a grey patina of damp and time. Deeper within, the crypt gave way to a compact chamber scarcely large enough for 2 coffins to lie side by side, yet there were 3. 2 leaden coffins were stacked one atop the other like macabre bunks. The uppermost casket bore a distinct human silhouette, its lead walls so thin in places that one could almost make out the contours of the form within. A thick film of greenish patina clung to the metal's surface, suggesting an otherworldly creature encased in its shell. The lower coffin, partially hidden by the one above, was a darker, duller shade of lead, its edges jagged, its shape less refined. Stanley set to work with pen and ledger, his handwriting neat despite the gloom. He recorded the Tudor rose emblem, stamped upon the upper coffin's lid, noting each petal carved in crisp relief. The Latin inscription beneath read, Elisabetha Prima Regina, which Stanley carefully transcribed in full. He also observed several crude scratchings, hardly the work of a skilled hand. The scrawled name, John Ware, and the date, 1645. This graffiti signified that, in that year, some bold soul, whether grave robber, pilgrim, or antiquarian, had ventured into the royal vault and left a mark of trespass. It was a stark reminder that the Abbey's subterranean realm was far from secure, that royal remains could tempt even the most pious or the most unscrupulous. As torches illuminated the chamber more fully, a sudden hiss rose from behind the lid of the upper coffin, as though the air itself was escaping after centuries of confinement. A thin, milky gas swirled upwards, carrying the unmistakable tang of decayed flesh, a heady mixture of methane, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia. The odour was sharp and metallic, like the stench of a forge's exhaust mingling with rotted wood. Workmen staggered back, eyes watering. Stanley inhaled through a handkerchief, the acrid scent stinging his lungs. Elizabeth Southwell's centuries-old testimony flickered to life in his mind. She had claimed that her queen's corpse once burst forth from its leaden shell when the gases accumulated too fiercely. Though Southwell's reliability had been questioned, modern understanding of decomposition in sealed containers affirmed her claim. Lead makes a near-perfect gas trap, allowing pressure to build until seams give way or metal deforms. The heavy coffins, each weighing several hundred pounds, required at least 8 strong men to maneuver. Their hoisting straps groaned under the strain, and a chill wind seemed to rise from the vault's depths, as though wraith-like currents circulated through the stonework. The sensation of cold air pricking the skin reminded those present of the living and the dead occupying the same narrow space. The coffin's combined weight bore down relentlessly, compressing the lower casket's occupant into a grotesque tableau of decay. Liquid byproducts of decomposition, dark, viscous, and unnameable, had seeped from minute cracks, pooling in shallow puddles around the foot of the lower coffin. This double-deck tomb had endured its morbid arrangement for more than 2 centuries, becoming both curiosity and abomination. Stanley's heart pounded as he documented the evidence of political posturing even in death. Here was a physical manifestation of power's reach. Queen Elizabeth, elevated above her half-sister Mary by royal decree and stubborn masonry alike. Mary, pressed beneath the weight of her siblings' lead-lined sarcophagus, a silent testament to dynastic rivalry. Such manipulation of mortal remains spoke volumes about the lengths rulers would go to assert authority, assertion that transcended life, bleeding into the quiet, claustrophobic corridors of the crypt. In subsequent weeks, Stanley's findings were published under a cloak of Victorian decorum. Official reports downplayed the acrid odour and the evidence of tampering. They praised the orderly arrangement of royal vaults and proclaimed that scientific inquiry would lead to better preservation. Yet those who read between the lines knew the truth. The Abbey's vaults were a battleground for memory and myth, where bones were moved as if on a chessboard, where lead coffins stored not only remains but fragments of scandal, ambition, and taboo. 3 years had passed since King James I orchestrated the solemn reburial of the Tudor sisters, and by the 1860s, Westminster Abbey's storied vaults lay in disarray. The once meticulously kept records of Henry VII's chapel had become a patchwork of conflicting entries and faded annotations. Coffins thought long sealed in one chamber were discovered elsewhere on crumbling ledgers. Even the resting place of King James himself had slipped from the official rolls into rumour and conjecture. Faced with this archival chaos, Queen Victoria granted Dean Arthur Penrhyn Stanley unprecedented permission to penetrate the Abbey's subterranean depths. Thus, on the 11th of February, 1869, precisely 366 years after Elizabeth of York drew her last breath, Stanley and his small team of craftsmen and labourers set forth to unearth the crypt's forgotten truths. At first light, a squad of masons and heraldic stoneworkers emerged from the Abbey's west door, their lanterns swaying in the chill morning air. Beneath vaulted ceilings carved with angels and shields, they knelt before a stone barrier no wider than 3 feet. This was the sealed entrance to the inner vaults, masonry so thick that sunlight faded entirely beyond its surface. Chisels rang against the block with hollow cadence, each strike echoing faintly through the labyrinthine passages beyond. Dean Stanley, ever the scholar, followed closely behind, clutching his ledger and quill. Every fragment of mortar that crumbled away seemed to strip another layer from history's dusty veneer. When the final stones were pried loose, a narrow door swung inward with a long, reluctant groan. Beyond lay a passageway dimly lit by the flicker of torches, its flagstone floor slick with centuries of damp. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Dean Stanley drew his robes closer as he stepped into the gloom. He counted each footstep against the sturdy walls, taped with wisps of mold and ancient graffiti. Finally, the corridor ended in a small chamber, scarcely more than 6 paces square, dominated by 2 leaden coffins stacked one atop the other. The sight was at once awe-inspiring and horrifying. The upper casket, crafted of dense lead sheets, bore the unmistakable silhouette of a human form, as though the metal had been molded around the flesh it contained. Its surface, once polished to a sheen, was mottled with greenish patina, the result of moisture's slow alchemy on the metal. Crisp above this discoloration was the Tudor rose, stamped in relief and centered upon the lid, its petals curling inward protectively. Beneath the rose, in precise Latin letters, ran the inscription Elisabetha Prima Regina, which Stanley transcribed meticulously, converting the Roman numerals into the date 1603. Yet amid this polished dignity were crude lines scratched at odd angles. The name John Ware and the scrawl 1645. These markings, jagged and raw, betrayed some daring soul's intrusion into the sanctity of royal sepulchre. Had this John Ware been a common grave robber or a zealot seeking relics for illicit rites? Dean Stanley shuddered at the thought. The crypt's holiness had clearly been violated long ago. With a soft click, workmen inserted a thin bar into the lid seam and pried it open by a few inches. Immediately, a thick cloud of gas hissed upward, as though exhaled by a creature that had lain dormant for centuries. The foul bouquet was overpowering, sweet, suffocating methane, the sharp egg-like odor of hydrogen sulfide, and the acrid tear, stinging bite of ammonia. Torches flickered violently as attendants coughed and flinched. Dean Stanley, ever the empiricist, jotted notes on the chemical composition of decomposition, mindful that lead enclosures acted as nearly perfect seals, trapping gases until pressure forced seams to yield. Inside that thin crack, the chamber revealed its true purpose. Not only a resting place, but a pressure cooker of death. Stanley compared these observations to accounts of Edward IV's exhumation at Windsor. There, centuries' worth of bodily fluids had melded with the decayed timber of the coffin, producing a thick, black sludge that pooled at the casket's foot. Elizabeth's coffin, in contrast, had contained its gruesome stew until this very moment. Its weight over 400 pounds demanded the strength of at least 8 bearers to maneuver. The paradox struck Stanley keenly. A sovereign's might, measured in fleets and armies, could accomplish nothing against the quiet inevitability of chemical decay. Once the gas dissipated, the lead lids were resealed, and attention turned to the monument above. James I had commissioned a monument of white marble, its surface carved to resemble the texture of fine linen. Master sculptor Maximilian Colt had rendered Elizabeth's effigy with uncanny realism. Her features captured in serene repose, lips slightly parted, hands folded as though in prayer. Painter Jean Dretz had added the finishing touches: ruby lips, emerald brooch, sapphire robe lining, transforming cold stone into a lifelike presence. Yet even as the marble effigy stood regal, the crypt's chill revealed a more sinister motif: political machinery in service of dynastic myth. Mary Tudor's name appeared nowhere on the monument's pristine facade, her remains concealed beneath. Her body, though physically present, was erased from the narrative of triumph. Dean Stanley noted the bitter irony. Stone and lead bore witness to a cruel hierarchy beyond life's reach, where memory itself could be reshaped through the placement of monuments and the omission of names. When the final chiseling and painting were complete, Dean Stanley and his team paused at the vault's entrance. The air felt stagnant once more, its gaseous breath now trapped beneath locked lids. They extinguished torches, leaving only a slender glimmer to guide them back through winding passages. As they ascended the steps toward the Abbey's sunlit nave, Dean Stanley felt the weight of what they had seen. Below the hallowed floor, 2 coffins lay in silent testimony, relics of a royal drama that played out in the lonely hush of sealed chambers. In the days and years that followed, Stanley's official report would speak of orderly arrangements and respectful monuments, glossing over the stench and the squat coffins. Yet in private journals, he recorded every detail: the green patina, the gas hiss, the name of John Ware, the unspoken politics sculpted in white marble. And though Westminster Abbey continued its eternal vigil above, he knew the crypt's secrets would linger in shadows, a reminder that even the mightiest empires leave behind unquiet bones and gasping whispers in the dark. The tale beneath Westminster Abbey's sacred floors did not begin with the Tudors, nor end with Queen Elizabeth's leaden sarcophagus. Dean Arthur Penrhyn Stanley soon discovered that the Abbey's vaults had long served as both refuge and battlefield for the corpses of royalty throughout the medieval and Renaissance eras. Among his dusty manuscripts, Stanley unearthed an account of King Henry II's startling exhumation of King Edward the Confessor in the year 1163. According to the Chronicle, Edward's coffin had been pried open by Henry's order, revealing a remarkable sight. The long, silvery beard of the pious king remained intact, draping over a cloisonné vestment of cloth of gold. A pilgrim's ring, still secure on Edward's finger, was extracted and converted into a sacred relic. Even more astonishing, the attenuated silk lining of the coffin was cut away and fashioned into a liturgical garment, transforming the late king's own shroud into a vestment worn in holy ceremonies. In that moment, Edward the Confessor's remains shifted from royal body to consecrated relic, illustrating how the dead could be repurposed to bolster the living church's authority. Moving forward a few centuries, Stanley encountered the grim legend of Duke Humphrey of Gloucester, whose tomb at St. Albans Abbey became the centre of an equally bizarre trade. Women of the court, it was said, queued in the chill of night to pay for vials containing the embalming fluid that preserved Humphrey's corpse. They believed this dark elixir could restore youth, smoothing wrinkles and whitening complexions. The sexton, ever opportunistic, sold the fluid by the dram, growing wealthy on the superstition of noble ladies. When the embalming fluid ran dry, the macabre commerce took on a new, more revolting form. Visitors began chipping away fragments of his hair and cutting shards of fingernail from Humphrey's desiccated remains. Over time, only a few shards of bone remained in his tomb, the rest dispersed among eager collectors. This grotesque marketplace, where royal flesh and bone served as currency, exposed the darkest intersections of power, profit, and superstition. Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's half-sister, suffered a similarly ignominious fate in more recent memory. In 1784, church wardens at St. Mary's, now known as Mary's Abbey, opened her vault on a flimsy pretext of structural repairs. There they found a cascade of golden hair, almost 3 feet long, preserved by the cool, damp air. Without ceremony, they clipped a lock and plucked a piece of her skin, stashing these grisly souvenirs in the vestry. In 1871, when King Richard II's tomb underwent restoration at Westminster, workmen retrieved dozens of splintered coffin boards and tattered scraps of royal vestments. These relics were placed in a metal tobacco box, which eventually languished in the storage rooms of the National Portrait Gallery. There, among forgotten journals and miniature portraits, lay a cache of artifacts that once encased monarchs, now reduced to fodder for dusty curiosity. From these chilling episodes, Stanley distilled a somber lesson. The bodies of kings and queens had been treated less as sacred vestiges of history than as commodities in a black market of relics. What began as rites of piety devolved into transactions of greed. The embalming fluid of a duke became a cosmetic potion. The hair of a queen turned into a trinket. The shroud of a saint, king repurposed as a ceremonial garment. If the living believed these relics held power, whether spiritual, political, or cosmetic, they were driven to desecrate the tombs of the dead to secure that power for themselves. Under the cavernous stone vaults of Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth and Mary, once fierce rivals for the throne, became silent witnesses to this cycle of desecration. In life, each had wielded authority, one as monarch of England and Ireland, the other, albeit briefly, in her own contested reign. In death, they became pawns in a more insidious contest. The struggle for narrative control, for political legitimacy, for the spoils of dynastic legacy. Their remains lay arranged, disturbed, and even robbed of dignity by generations of those who believed bones could serve as proof of power. Dean Stanley approached his work with the patience of an archaeologist and the compassion of a reluctant confessor. He recorded every exhumation, every stolen lock of hair, every repurposed relic with meticulous care. Yet he was equally cautious, knowing that Victorian sensibilities could not tolerate the full horror of these revelations. His public reports spoke of respectful measures and preservation techniques, omitting the grotesque truths of theft and commerce. Privately, however, he amassed a trove of notes and sketches, ensuring that the unvarnished story of churchwardens and barbarians would survive in his personal papers. In the end, nothing in the Abbey's soaring vaults could mask the reality that fame and flesh are intolerant bedfellows. The same hands that carved marble effigies and painted grand murals also chipped away bone and blasted open sarcophagi. The same voices that chanted funeral masses for a queen could bargain over her hair or her embalming fluids in backroom deals. For Dean Stanley, the greatest tragedy lay not in the death of these sovereigns inevitable as the cycle of life, but in the way their corpses were transformed into relics of avarice. Thus, in the dim depths of Westminster's Undercroft, Stanley uncovered a history that no formal record dared to proclaim, that the final resting places of royalty were not sanctuaries of eternal sleep, but theatres for the living's ceaseless enactment of power and desire. He closed his journal with a simple, sorrowful line. In the end, the price of royal renown is the body's surrender to forces far more merciless than time. In the quiet corridors of Westminster Abbey, Dean Arthur Penrhyn Stanley discovered that royal exhumations were not confined to the Tudors alone. Among his many dusty records lay an astonishing account of Queen Catherine of Valois, the widow of King Henry V. After Catherine's untimely death in the year 1437, her circumstances were so dire that the Abbey, strapped for funds, elected to display her decaying body to the public as a means of generating income. A simple wooden coffin was placed before the high altar, and admission fees were charged to all who wished to glimpse the Queen's mortal remains. Visitors queued in long lines outside the nave, coins clinking in eager hands, anticipating the spectacle of a once glorious monarch reduced to rotting flesh. Inside the dimly lit space, a hush fell over the crowd as they stepped across the threshold. Candlelight flickered against the coffin's aged wood, illuminating the cracks and warped panels that attested to the rigours of death and display. Catherine's body lay clad in a faded velvet gown, now moth-eaten and dust-laden, her golden hair splayed like autumn leaves upon a pall of threadbare cloth. For many, the sight was both shocking and reverent. Here lay a woman who had once captivated the court of France and England, now transformed into a macabre emblem of mortality. Some turned away in tears, while others leaned forward to study the details of her collapsed form, as though each fold of decayed fabric held a hidden truth. Outside the Abbey's heavy wooden doors, a more sordid commerce had taken root. Souvenir hunters and charlatans mingled amid the throng, offering splinters of Catherine's coffin to any who would pay. Small fragments of the velvet gown, picked from the ground near the coffin's foot, were claimed to possess healing properties. A sliver of her skin, retrieved surreptitiously by a daring attendant, changed hands for a small fortune among apothecaries, who mixed it into salves promising to cure rheumatism or restore vitality. The market for relics of Catherine's corpse burgeoned into a thriving black market, complete with secret stalls in side chapels and whispered negotiations behind pillars of polished stone. Decades later, in the year 1618, another layer of artifice was added to Elizabeth I's resting place. A lacquered wooden effigy of the Queen was refurbished with fresh paint and a new costume. A crimson robe lined with plush mink, a cerulean orb in the left hand, and a golden chain adorned with jewelled pendants. The embellishment was intended to reaffirm the Queen's immortal image, to mask any hint of corruption beneath the veneer of regal splendour. Yet when Stanley opened the vault more than 2 centuries later, he found that the effigy's paint had long since flaked away, revealing nothing but pristine white gypsum beneath. There, in the cold light of his lantern, stood the naked form of plaster, a barren shell that had concealed a far grimmer reality. Beneath the monument, Elizabeth's lead coffin bore down on Mary Tudor's fragile remains, forcing the fluids of decomposition to seep upward into seams and onto the block stones below. Stanley could not help but recall similar discoveries at the tomb of King Richard II. At Windsor, When workers lifted the great stone lid, they encountered a skeleton nearly complete, its bones still articulated, as though waiting for a final breath. Yet where Richard's sinews and leather boots once held the frame together, only a sticky amalgam of tattered cloth and coagulated fat remained. Further astonishment came years later, when curators at the National Portrait Gallery uncovered a small metal tobacco box buried in the basement. Inside lay splinters of royal coffin wood, rotted fragments of velvet lining, and minute shards of bone once parts of monarchs' bodies, now stowed away among forgotten art prints and dusty ledgers. From these chilling vignettes, Stanley distilled a sobering truth. No matter how exalted one's rank, in death, every person becomes a vessel of both reverence and exploitation. He penned in his journal that power's greatest illusion is the promise of eternal dignity, yet the reality is one of secrecy, superstition, and avarice. The truly sacred treasure of monarchy, he reflected, is not the crown or the scepter, but the body itself treated with solemn respect, shielded from profane hands. Once a corpse becomes a commodity broken apart for relics, sold piece by piece, its sanctity is irrevocably lost, and history's veneer of honor falls away to reveal the brutal undercurrents of human desire. As Stanley emerged from the crypt into the hush of the Abbey's nave, he paused beneath the vaulted ceiling. Light streamed through stained glass windows, casting coloured patterns upon the stone floor. Choir boys' voices drifted softly from the chapel, rehearsing hymns of praise and remembrance. Yet in the dean's mind, the echo of his discoveries lingered a reminder of how easily the bones of kings could be repurposed, venerated one moment, desecrated the next. In that sacred place, he resolved to preserve these records, to ensure that the mistreatment of royal remains would not be brushed aside by future generations eager for spectacle or profit. In time, the Abbey returned to its solemn duty, closing its doors to those who would trade in human fragments. The effigies stood once more in silent vigil, their painted forms now weathered by centuries of neglect. But beneath the stone and marble, the coffins remained a double martyrdom of lead and memory. And for those who dared to explore the tombs below, the Abbey offered an unspoken lesson, that the glory of monarchs is fleeting, and the only legacy that endures is the careful stewardship of their final rest. Dean Arthur Penrhyn Stanley's journals reveal that the saga of royal exhumations did not begin with the Tudors, but reached back into the dark heart of the 12th century. In the year 1163, at the command of King Henry II, the tomb of King Edward the Confessor was forced open in Westminster Abbey's dim vaults. Stanley painstakingly recorded the account. When the monks lifted the stone lid, they found Edward's skeleton remarkably intact. His long white beard, still silky despite the passage of nearly a century, lay draped over a linen shroud. He wore a mitre embroidered with gold thread, and his feet were sheathed in velvet slippers dyed a deep purple. Most astonishing of all was the pilgrim's ring discovered on his finger, a simple band of silver that the clergy at once elevated to a holy relic. The fingertips of the monks trembled with awe as they removed strands of that pure white beard and cut away portions of the fabric lining, distributing them among the faithful who believed in their miraculous curative powers. Stanley noted, almost in a whisper, that the very elements of Edward's body, the hair, the garment, the ring, were transformed into instruments of devotion, even as the king's flesh lay forgotten in its sarcophagus. As he traced the platinum highlights of this medieval drama, Stanley posed a question that would echo through his subsequent studies. Is the body meant for remembrance or for appropriation? The pattern, he observed, repeated itself too often. Just as Edward's beard and vestments became commodities traded among pilgrims, so too had the body of Duke Humphrey and the relics of Mary Tudor been plundered. Entire markets had formed around embalming fluids, bones, and locks of hair, treating royal corpses as if they were curiosities in a merchant's stall. Even Elizabeth I's lead coffin, despite being guarded by noble attendants, had borne the scratch marks of John Ware, a brazen trespasser who hacked at the metal to leave his crude mark. The Abbey's subterranean corridors, though built to honour the dead, had become a labyrinth of temptation, where the promise of power or profit lured the curious into sacrilege. Stanley turned next to the monument erected above Elizabeth's burial vault. Originally painted in lacquered brilliance, the wooden effigy had been refreshed in the year 1618 with vibrant hues. A crimson robe lined in sable furs, a cerulean orb in her left hand, and a gilded chain adorning her neck. The pageantry was intended to fortify her myth as the Virgin Queen, an icon of eternal sovereignty. Yet by the time Stanley unlocked the crypt, the paint had long since flaked away, leaving only the chalky white gypsum of the carving. He described the scene with a trembling pen. Here lies the dazzling facade, now stripped of its finery, revealing the bare skeleton of ambition beneath. In that stark contrast between the gaudy surface and the lead-cased tomb below, Stanley saw the ultimate deception. A government's will to cloak decay in splendor, to mask the rot of power behind layers of color and ceremony. His notes further detailed the complexity of the Abbey's underground approaches. Stone corridors branched and twisted in deliberate confusion, so that only those with precise knowledge of the vault's layout could locate the royal sepulchres. Security seemed impregnable. Heavy doors bolted from within, iron grills, sealing passages, and chains of wardens sworn to protect sacred remains. And yet the presence of John Ware's grotesque graffiti etched in black against the pale lead proved the system's fragility. Even the most elaborate defences could not forestall mortal curiosity or covetousness. In one narrow passage, Ware had scrawled his name and date in cramped letters, immortalizing himself as a patron saint of grave robbers. Stanley recorded this with quiet indignation, noting that the very bones meant to inspire reverence instead attracted desecration. In the closing lines of this chapter, Dean Stanley distilled his reflections into a single, somber maxim. True veneration does not hide, but lets the departed rest. He observed that when the living excavate the past solely to satisfy scientific ambition or ravenous greed, they commit an offence akin to sacrilege and affront, not only to the dead, but to the essence of humanity itself. The Abbey, with all its soaring arches and radiant windows, stood as a testament to faith, art, and memory. Yet beneath its polished mosaics lay a darker chronicle, one of bodies treated as trophies, legends moulded by convenience, and the inexorable decay that no crown or ceremony could avert. Stanley's final admonition carried the force of a moral reckoning. If society truly sought to honour its ancestors, it must do so by preserving their dignity in death, resisting the impulse to treat them as relics or curiosities. In that silent vault of Westminster Abbey, he found a mirror for the broader human condition. That power, unchecked and unexamined, transforms reverence into exploitation, and that only through humility and restraint can the living offer a genuine tribute to those who lie beneath. Dean Arthur Penrhyn Stanley's exhaustive survey of Westminster Abbey's subterranean vaults drew to a close with a haunting tableau. Two leaden coffins lying silent beneath layers of stone, yet subject to the relentless passage of time. The once pristine lead surfaces had dulled to mottled grey, where rainwater and moisture had seeped through tiny fissures, leaving streaks of verdigris that ran like tears across the metal. The Tudor rose emblem had lost its sharp edges, its petals worn smooth by centuries of sediment. Even the crude graffiti etched by John Ware in the year 1645 had begun to fade, the jagged letters blurring into the pitted lead as though the tomb itself sought to erase evidence of trespass. Each time Stanley imagined descending into that cramped chamber, he could almost taste the stale air thick with the remnants of decay. He pictured the lingering haze of methane and hydrogen sulfide that had once burst from the upper casket in a hiss, now dissipated, but still palpable to the mind's eye. The lead lids, once so flat and uniform, had warped ever so slightly where internal pressures had pushed against their enclosing walls, creating gentle bows and ridges. In the torchlight, those distortions would catch shadows and highlight contours, as if to remind any explorer that the coffins were living entities in their own right, expanding and contracting with each breath of the earth. Above them stood the marble effigy of Elizabeth I, its alabaster glow dimmed by flakes of missing lacquer. The iron bracket that had once held her sceptre now protruded like a broken limb, and the carved drapery of her gown showed the faintest hairline cracks. In 1975, Stanley had noted, restorers had affixed a replica of the Three Brothers collar to the effigy's neck in a bid to renew her immortal image. This gilded necklace, modelled on a Renaissance pendant, featuring three interlocking hearts, sparkled incongruously against the weathered stone. To Stanley, the addition felt like dressing a skeleton in finery, a fruitless effort to keep the lead coffin fresh, while the body within decays unnoticed. He likened the painted monument to a flimsy cloak, concealing brutal decomposition beneath layers of feigned magnificence. In his final journal entry on the Abbey's crypt, Dean Stanley reflected on the democratic nature of death itself. He wrote of Elizabeth, the most splendid heroine of Europe, now subject to the same laws of dissolution as the humblest pauper. Beneath the lead, all prestige evaporated. Only compressed fragments of bone and viscous remnants of bodily fluids remained, united in an unvarnished refusal of hierarchy. Stanley mused that the truly equalizing moment in life is the day one's breath ceases and one becomes subject to gravity and time. No crown, no scepter, he penned, can withstand the quiet insistence of entropy. His tone grew almost reverent as he contemplated the broader implications of his discoveries. The interplay of live subjects, scholars, nobles, restorers, and their dead patrons formed a continuum in which memory and power were negotiated. "We weave narratives around these interred bodies," he wrote, cementing reputations while ignoring the sanctity of the remains themselves. To Stanley, the Abbey's vaults offered a moral imperative, that human remains should be regarded not as curiosities for display or evidence in scholarly debate, but as sacred heritage, demanding silence and respect. He closed his notebook with a challenge to succeeding generations. Would they allow the past to rest, undisturbed, honored in its final privacy, or would they persist in prying open tombs to satisfy scientific curiosity or the hunger for political advantage? In those last sentences, the Dean's voice trembled between admonition and hope. "The true measure of our character," he wrote, "lies in our ability to leave the dead to their sleep, untroubled by the living's restless hands." I see. And so, in the silent depths of Westminster Abbey, the question remains etched in shadow. Can we resist the temptation to disturb the quiet of history's sleeping hearts? Or will we continue to unearth their secrets in pursuit of our own fleeting prominence? The answer, echoing through the stone corridors where only torchlight dares to linger, speaks to the very soul of modernity and to the respect we owe to those who came before. And now, dear listener, let us slow our breath and let the weight of the Abbey's stones recede into the soft mist of memory. Imagine the flicker of a single candle, its pale glow dancing upon ancient walls before dimming into the quiet hush of night. The coffins and effigies we have shared of queens and kings, of ambition and decay, can rest now in the gentle cradle of our imagination, their sharp edges softened by the tender light of understanding. In the end, this tale of royal tombs and hidden graffiti, of marble monuments and leaden caskets, speaks to the profound truth that death is the great equalizer. No matter how glittering one's crown, how stirring one's triumphs in life, we all ultimately return to the same gentle earth. Yet within that inevitability lies a gift, the reminder that our time here is finite, and that compassion, respect, and quiet reverence are the most enduring legacies we can leave behind. So let us carry forward the lesson hidden beneath Westminster's stones. To honor both the living and the dead with kindness, to choose empathy over curiosity, and to protect the stories of the past without ravaging their sacred silence. As you drift towards sleep, picture the Abbey bathed in moonlight, its windows casting pale mosaics across a world hushed and still, where even the faintest heartbeat of history can rest untroubled. May your dreams be as peaceful as the vaulted ceilings above those silent vaults, and may the promise of tomorrow awaken you with gentle hope. Thank you for joining this journey into time's hidden corridors. If these stories have touched you, please subscribe to our channel for more whispered adventures and softly glowing tales from history's quiet corners. Sleep well, dear friend, and good night.